The Persona franchise began as a spin-off of Shin Megami Tensei, a series of games I never bothered with since I am not a fan of horror. Persona had its share of occult and creepy monsters, but it was also a JRPG with lots of mix and match of magic attacks to keep me going. The first game was extremely hard to get into. Partly crude-looking polygons and partly low-frame sprite animations took me over a week to tolerate its ugliness. It was mostly because of the first-person perspective when walking through monster-infested areas. There was no point in that feature. It made it hard to move around, you never saw any monsters that way, and because of the zooming, the mapping on the walls looked horribly pixelated. Also, there was not much character charisma since everyone was an archetype with a simple personality and backdrop. The main character doesn't even have that since he's a blunt self-insert silent protagonist. The only exception is Maki, the main girl in the team, and only because she's unknowingly the cause of the conflict. The thing it had for grabbing you was the occult theme, and if you invested enough time, the cool concept of imagination affecting reality. It's basically about a bunch of chuny teenagers thinking they are JoJo and getting stands, with which they transfer to other realities and fight demons summoned by an evil corporation run by adults. Sounds like the worst type of escapism you can find in a light novel, doesn't it? In this case, it's not, because getting what you want easily with magic only proved how little value it had when not struggling to achieve it. In fact, the bad guys who used the demons for manifesting their desires ended up wishing for the whole world to be destroyed. So in a way it's about anti-escapism, since the message is, if you get what you want without any effort, you will only get depressed with how hollow your life is. Another somewhat memorable thing is the option to negotiate with the monsters you are fighting. You are given a set of options, and if you press the right ones, you get a reward. It was gimmicky, but it still gave you the option to win without fighting all the time. So, do I recommend playing this game? No, because the next Persona is the exact same thing, only 10 times better. The visuals didn't improve that much, but at least they took out the first-person view. The plot is the exact same as the one in the first game, only this time, everyone is behind the cause of the conflict. Heroes and villains are far more fleshed out and thus more memorable, and the concept of imagination affecting reality became part of the gameplay instead of background lore limited to the narrative. You are allowed to spread rumors around the city, which are magically becoming a reality if enough people believing them, opening up new shops and altering a bit the plot depending on your choices. Basically, in Persona 2, everyone was a chuny, and no, it was not a crappy empowerment fantasy for introvert teenagers, since it ended up backfiring when the bad guys used the same trick for spreading their own nasty rumors. The final boss was Hitler and an army of cyborg Nazis, all because of a rumor. This was so crazy it made it impossible for the game to be localized for almost 2 decades. I had to play a fan-made translation since I couldn't find an official release even during the PlayStation 2 era. The great thing about Persona 2 is that they liked the concept so much to the point they made a sequel to it. For all I care, this was the thematic pinnacle of the entire franchise. The new heroes were facing the consequences of the mistake the previous heroes made. Plus, for the first and only time, the characters were not teenagers spending most of their time in a high school. Everyone was an adult and had his own job, making it 10 times more interesting than done-to-death teenagers and schools. I loved it and I highly recommend everyone to check it out. Oh, and I might as well add how the basic plot is the same as Madoka Magica, only 1,000 times better written. What, you actually thought Urobucher can write original stories without ripping them off from earlier superior works and not making a complete mess out of them? Of course not, you idiots! The same concept was done better during the 90s, and Urobucher did nothing but turn everything he touched into a pretentious pile of edgelord garbage. Retro always wins! Persona 3 abandoned the awfully looking sprite and polygon combo and became fully 3D. Unlike most franchises which had a hard time during the transition, it was not an issue here. It took many years for the next game to be created and the technology had improved tremendously. By being 3D, there was a lot more freedom of motion during dungeon exploration, and unlike Persona 1, it was very helpful in this case. Now you could see the enemies as they could see you, instead of the random encounter system from before. Basically, there was a factor of stealth and tactics when it came to ambushing the enemies or being attacked from behind as opposed to appearing out of nowhere. The gameplay removed the negotiation option from the battles, which was disappointing since it was the gimmick that was giving the franchise its distinctive flavor. But it's not like it became worse without it, since it got replaced by the social links, a system which increased the interaction with the world even further. In Persona 2, the rumors were affecting gameplay, but there was no personal connection or much of a strategy in how you used them. It was just choosing what a bunch of minor NPCs would do out of screen. In contrast, the social links were a much better game mode than the rumors and even the negotiation system. It wasn't about attacking to mass-produced monsters during battle. That was dumb in a way. Why would the fighting stop just to listen to you? It was a smart thing to separate the chatting part from the battles and take it to moments of peace. Nighttime was your typical action-packed dungeon crawling, and daytime was all about strengthening your bonds with characters that now had a name, a personality, and a backdrop. If you were doing it enough times without messing up in the choices you were making, your statistics and powers during battle would increase. And since you didn't have infinite time to accomplish something, you couldn't unlock everything early in the game, nor you could grind your experience points indefinitely. There was limitation in what you could do, so you had to focus in specific activities instead of being a jack of all trades with no pressure from the passing of time. The plot was still about Chuni's affecting reality with stunts and going on isekai acid trips, but it was lacking the occult atmosphere of Persona 2. The monsters were no longer called demons, they got renamed to shadows. It was thematically stronger since now they were the dark aspects of people's psyche instead of figments of imagination from various mythologies. At the same time, they didn't feel as scary as when they were demons that came from hell to eat you alive. And although there was pressure from time running out, you were so absorbed in strengthening your bonds with others, to the point the protection of the world was more of an afterthought. It wasn't immersion breaking, but when it came to the core storyline there wasn't as much tension as before. This becomes apparent when you defeat all the evil shadows your boss was telling you about since the beginning of the game. Turns out you were being manipulated by an evil corporation for awakening a threat that can destroy the world. This should have been a mind-blowing moment, just like in Persona 2, where the heroes are the ones causing the problem with their Chuni powers. Also, the evil adults working in the shady corporation were pretending to be your allies instead of obvious one-dimensional megalomaniacs. And yet there was no punch to this twist, because I had spent 90% of the time doing irrelevant slice-of-life activities to the point of not being invested. In the previous games, Kandori and Joker had a very strong presence throughout the story. Here, this thing named Nyx appears in the last part of the game, and all of a sudden, it's the final boss which you have to defeat for some reason. Who the hell are you and why am I supposed to care? In conclusion, gameplay, visuals and character appeal have improved tremendously since Persona 2, but the overall narrative and atmosphere are nowhere near as good. It's a better game with a far worse script. Persona 4 didn't make any drastic changes to the gameplay. Statistics became more elaborate and social links had more variants for restricting the player from forming a harem by dating everyone at the same time. The biggest change was the aesthetics. The previous three personas were taking themselves seriously. They had mostly dark colors and the characters were experiencing constant mindfucks. Persona 4 has bright colors, it is much more light-hearted in tone, and in this particular case it worked in its favor. The problem with Persona 3 was its lack of tension. The characters were still presented as tragic or occasionally suffering from mental issues, yet the actual game was hardly about that. The social links were sapping away any sense of drama, so when you spend the day going on silly dates as if you are playing a date simulation, and the night in fighting Jungian horrors by constantly shooting yourself in the head as if it's an edgelord creepfest, then you get an enormous tonal whiplash between the two game modes. Persona 4 fixes this problem by adding a lot more comedy and by lowering the overall edginess of the atmosphere. The two modes are no longer that different in tone, and thus blend better. To the most part, I was disinterested with whatever I was doing in Persona 3. I was having a blast with most of the activities in Persona 4. It knew it couldn't be serious, so it didn't bother, and that did wonders. By the way, I'm not saying the serious atmosphere was bad for Persona 1 and 2. It was fine there because they weren't social links taking up most of the game. If you can't get rid of them, you might as well make the atmosphere more uplifting to match the tone. So basically, as long as you convince yourself you are playing a romantic school comedy date simulation that occasionally throws in a silly murder mystery for flavor, you are going to have a great time. If, on the other hand, you expect to find something heavily based on the social anxiety of toonies, as they affect reality with their delusions before everything goes to hell because they realize it's all hollow and depressing, then you're going to hate this game because it's not there anymore. And even if you do, it's still way more honest and charming than the tonal mess that was Persona 3. And it's not like Persona 4 didn't improve the whole fighting the shadows theme. In Persona 3 you were tasked to defeat these big shadows that didn't have any personality or direct connection with the characters. They were just generic monsters you had to defeat. In Persona 4, every major boss is the inner demon of a character. The shadows represent the dark thoughts and desires of the main characters, going as far as openly saying it instead of leaving it up to interpretation, as was the case with people losing their emotions in Persona 3. Persona 4 is a romantic school comedy, but at least the monsters had some connection with what was going on. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I can say the same thing about the main bad guy. Despite a still lacking presence compared to Kandori and Joker, when the revelation came up it was like, oh snap, it was him all along? It was way more impactful because he was next to you the whole time and he wasn't trying to stand out as important, like your serious boss turning out to be evil. But yeah, he was still not that great of a villain and his motives were weak as hell. Also, a cosmic horror appears out of nowhere that seems completely unrelated with everything you were doing so far, and you're like, what the heck is that doing here? Once again, they are throwing in a final boss without proper foreshadowing, something which was not the case in Persona 1 and 2. And finally we have Persona 5, the recent addition to the franchise. The visuals improved even further and now look artistic as fuck. They brought back the negotiation and battles, which I missed so much since the second game. Also, the shadows who become evil counterparts have even more personality and presence than before. Now it's like they are characters of their own. There is also the great concept of mass media manipulating the will of the people, as well as mankind feeling safe when it's being controlled. Unfortunately, this is where the game falls flat, because what could have elevated it to a great theme is presented in a very superficial and eventually dumb way. Kandori and Joker may have been straightforward when it comes to bad guys, but the great thing about them is how they realized the mistake of using supernatural means to get what they want by getting what they want. Their catharsis was a self-realization based on their actions, which gave them depth in the long run. The villains in Persona 5 are light novel garbage. They don't realize their mistake on their own, and they essentially get brainwashed into repenting by kicking the crap out of them. This is not character development, it's character rewrite. And I have to add how Kandori and Joker were not torturing their subordinates for the heck of it, unlike the Palace Masters, who are literally one-dimensional evil rapists who laugh like maniacs and love to destroy the lives of innocents. Coupled with how the atmosphere remains light-hearted when it's otherwise dealing with socio-political issues and the worst people imaginable, and you got the same tonal whiplash as Persona 3, where you had a date simulation clashing with people turning to coffins and shooting yourself in the head repeatedly. Persona 4 wasn't trying to be edgy or deep, and that's why it was such a fun game. Also, they went overboard with the empowerment fantasy and lost any sense of subtlety. It's true that the thing was always about toony teenagers going against evil adults, but it was never done in such a volume. The good guys are a bunch of edgy dressed posers, breaking the law, ridiculing the abusing adults, and becoming heroes in the eyes of victimized teenagers. Where is the backlash of using their powers? Where are the negative consequences? They don't exist anymore. And holy shit, they sexualized the female characters to ridiculous levels. The blonde one in particular gets sexually harassed by every male in the whole game. And what's with the twist of the final boss being the Holy Grail? The truth about Igor, the lowly jailers, and the God of Control were last-moment plot twists that were there for the heck of it. I mean, there were lots of twists regarding who was the killer in Persona 4, but they didn't matter much and were thematically relevant. In Persona 5, there is no thematic need for any of that. They could have stopped at defeating the corrupt politician and his illegitimate son, and it would be fine. But no, we need a dumb cosmic horror to fight, even if it comes out of thin air. This is something Persona 1 and 2 did not suffer from. As you see from this chart, it comes down to eternal punishment being the best, but you can't fully appreciate it without first playing Innocent Sin. Persona 1 is completely skippable since all its good ideas are present in Persona 2. Persona 3 is dull as hell, suffers from tonal whiplash, and later games fix its problems, so I also don't recommend playing it. Persona 4 is a blast if you play it for fun instead of giving a damn about the plot or the themes. And Persona 5 has easily the best gameplay and visual presentation, with everything else being terrible. As it happens with most franchises, visuals and gameplay constantly improve, but the quality of writing and the atmosphere keep getting worse. Once again it is proven, Retro always wins!